Hey, it's Chase from On the Table Gaming, and today we're going to be looking at House Martell for A Song of Ice and Fire, the miniatures game. I'm joined by CMON's design director, Michael Chanel, and game designer, Fabio Curry, to talk about the latest faction for A Song of Ice and Fire, the miniatures game. Thank you so much for both joining us today.
Hey Chase, it's great to be here after a while now. I'm glad you're back on track with your episodes.
Yeah, back and ready to rock. I gotta kick the sand out of my sandals here.
And we're already starting off with the puns. We're off to a fantastic start here, Chase. It's good to see you again.
I'm excited. So House Martell is the 9th faction for A Song of Ice and Fire, the miniatures game. A game that, many of us is following now for, like over half a decade. Actually, for you, Michael, it probably goes back even further, right?
Yeah, definitely a little bit further than that. It's not as far as, Mr. Martin and his 20 plus years of writing these books, obviously, but we're technically catching up, although he's got a fair lead.
Oh, fair enough. I think it's a fair statement there. Now, if you'll recall, going back to right after the Kickstarter launch and they started being fulfilled, and you said a few things that I still remember. So, first on air, you stated an often misquoted line about, 9 factions for A Song of Ice and Fire, the miniatures game. And then the second thing you said was something like, there's nothing that the internet cannot twist. Can you maybe clear the air before we move on and have our celebratory episode here? Where do we stand with things? This is actually the 9th faction for A Song of Ice and Fire, the miniatures game. What does that mean?
It means that this was the 9th one that has been released, and that's exactly what that means. What I can say to that is I remember that, very distinctly back when we were having our CMON Expo. I think this was like the 2nd or 3rd one that we had. And the question came up, when we were talking about Song of Ice and Fire, and it was that we had at least 9 factions planned for the game. And the problem is that people really, really seem to like forgetting that little preface there about at least, and taking that to mean, oh, there's a hardcore limit of 9 factions, which, that whole quote was made at the very beginning to show that, no, it is not going to be just Starks and Lannisters, as we revealed that we actually have plans for the future of this game and everything. And of course, the internet being what it is, latched on to 9 factions. That's a hardcore number, hardcore set thing. That's all we're going to have. So every time that we have Mummerings coming out, they're always like, what are the 9 going to be? Because it can't be any more than that, because things never change. So, that's a thing. That's probably one of the quotes. There's 2 quotes I remember from the early days, and that's definitely one of them that sticks with me, is why did people latch onto that? And then it was during that same weekend that we were talking about potential things for the future. And I had mentioned we could have anything, we could have, Robb Stark, King of the North. We could have a mounted Tywin Lannister. And the internet latched on to that mounted Tywin Lannister comment. And since then, years and years ago, every time we're going to do any type of release for Lannisters, people have been asking when's that promised mounted Tywin coming out? And, the narrative it's a game of telephone. I wish I could say that people have not seen that in real time developing over any type of media or news that happens. But, that's the thing. You say one thing and then someone hears it and interprets it one way. And then all of a sudden you've said this entirely different thing. Granted, this is a way smaller scale than that. But I guess to answer your question with my long rant right there, yes, this is the 9th faction for the game that's come out. What does that mean? This is the 9th one, just before the 10th one has come out and after the 8th one. Now, I'm going to say it's only going to be a matter of time, because I just said 10th right there, that people are already going to say,
only 10.
10. But I'll let them have that one.
All right, we're already off to a strong start here.
In a game of telephone, you ring or you die.
Fabio, I think we're on the same page for this. So let's get into it. Let's start talking about the Martells. And I'm excited to talk a little bit about what's in the core box and really your design philosophy and what the thought was going into this faction. So before we jump in here, actually, Fabio, maybe you could give us a quick overview of what do you see as the faction identity for the Martells, kind of writ large?
I'll start with one of the challenges is that the Martells in the books, they're actually pretty secretive with their troops, right? So we had to think on the big picture of the faction, and we kind of, let's say, located ourselves in 2 things, right? They must be agile, right? We don't imagine them wearing the heaviest of armor in the very hot desert. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing that we really thought, so that's really talking about the troops, right? And how the troops maneuver around, which was, I'd say, one of the challenges. And the other thing that we thought that was pretty important was the way their NCUs play, which they're always very calculating, and they do tend to lean towards control, and they're very disruptive on the court, right? So I'd say that their NCU playstyle is very lean towards control, while them on the battlefield they are very lean towards reaction and maneuvering. But you'll see that in a very different way and a different feel than the other maneuverings from other factions. So Starks maneuver way differently, right, than Targaryens and Greyjoys, which are factions that like to claim horses and kind of pivot around moving on the battlefield, right? And you'll see that Martells do that in a very different and pretty unique way.
Yeah, speaking about it from like not even just a design standpoint, but like the one quote that comes to my head is, the Dornish bide their time. They're in it for the long game. That's kind of their whole mantra and everything throughout those series as it's been leading up. But when it comes from like a design standpoint, we have our mechanics in mind and everything, but when it comes to like the aesthetics and everything, which does go a lot to shape how the faction actually plays, because you can't have a faction look a certain way and then have it just play an entirely different way. That creates a disconnect, and it's just, that doesn't really work. So whenever we're making a new faction, we basically have an initial draft document that has like, here are basically the visual examples of how these troops would look, what their kind of general feel would be. That goes then through George, and he gives the approval or not and changes back and forth. Like we've had many podcasts before in the past talking about, back in the start when the Starks, went through numerous revisions to match, what he envisioned their armor and everything to be. The same thing happens here with the Martells. Now, granted, this happened a long time ago because okay, this is the newest faction. This is not like something that we just started working on recently. We've had plans for these things for a long, long time. We play the long game, just like our Dornish friends here.
Is that kind of a pun from Michael? That's a kind of a turn of phrase. I liked it though.
The closest we'll get.
Remember this, internet.
So, when it comes to the design philosophy there, you have your ideas for a faction. You don't want that to overlap too much with the existing stuff that's out there. So, we can say, oh, yes, they're very maneuverable. But then if we just say that, then people are like, okay, well, we have Starks, we have Targaryens, we have Greyjoys. They're all about maneuverability. But it's in different ways. Like, you're not going to have just the sheer raw aggression that you're going to have in some of the other factions. This is more kind of like your tricksy bit. This is going to be, the one of the comparisons I make is like Lannister is like playing the control and denial game with like the tactics cards, your NCUs, and kind of the political fields. The Martells are kind of like that, except on the battle. They have a lot of your tricks that you can do in that regard. And of course, they have their NCU and tactics tricks as well. But this is going to be more so about like basically punishing and debuffing a lot of the enemy units in various ways, and not so much about like bolstering their own. Like Greyjoys are going to get stronger as the game goes on, as they're getting their pillage tokens up. Targaryens, if they can start getting that snowball effect going, they can start just raging through the enemy. Here with the Martells, they're more about like, okay, this is a key threat or a problem here that we need to strike at, and then not necessarily wipe out and destroy, but we're going to have effects that are going to hamper and disrupt the enemy field tactics while throwing in some, NCU and off the field denial as well. So I would almost like, if we want to talk to like any veteran players out there, I'd almost say like, think of these guys sort of like combat Lannisters.
Oh, interesting. There's a lot of design space with all these factions, but for the Dornish forces, the Martells here in general, there's a ton of potential for like NCUs and named characters. Like there's a lot of names that get dropped in the books. But, at the same time, like, Fabio was hinting at, like a lot of times the combat units themselves, aren't necessarily specifically named as much. This is a faction that, we're able to withstand the Targaryens at their height. These are a military force that are kind of talked about, but a lot of times like in the abstract. Does that ever present challenges in the actual like planning out of a faction when maybe it kind of skews one way?
Oh, absolutely. And I'll let Fabio talk more on this, but the part that I will contribute here is that when it comes to that, in the early days of the game, whenever we were passing everything through George and he was giving us feedback and whatnot, he was very much, we were still building our rapport and our relationship up, and he wanted to make sure that everything that we referenced, was somewhere in the books. Karstark Spearmen. Mm-hmm. We had some liberties like Umber Berserkers; those we got a little bit of a pass, but that wasn't so much outside the realm of possibility. And that rapport is built up over the years. Where everything that we make, there's a lot of things that we've made in this faction that, especially when it comes to the Dornish and the Martells here, that no, they're not referenced anywhere in the books because the standing military force of Martells is not really expanded upon. And plus, when you get back to it, all of these were really just a bunch of guys with spears or guys with swords. They didn't have fancy names or everything, but everything that we do is still passed through George. This is the unit concept we have. This is the name we wanted. Does this all fit? He gives us feedback, a yes or no, corrects it and everything. So, this all passes through him. So, for the sake of gameplay, are these we have Dune Vipers, sand skirmishers, these things. Are these things are militaries going to call these guys this? No, not necessarily. They're not going to call these Unleash the Umber Berserkers. As cool as that sounds, that's not something you're going to hear. But you are going to hear oh yes, these are Sunspire Royal Guard, or these are spearmen. Yeah, those things will exist. But that's where the game interacts with your lore and your backstory. Because otherwise, if we're being frankly honest.
Yeah, and that being said, right, because of course there is all this back and forth that goes on for sure, and then the challenge is kind of finding the right that will create confusion among players. There needs to be certain overlap, different names, and they're just slightly different, and that's not good for the health of the game.
Song of Ice and Fire, the miniatures game, the 9th faction. I kind of wonder what you see the balance of as a designer. Is there attention to design just around the greatest hits, and what might be an example of maybe some of you're kind of pushing the envelope a little bit with here, trying out?
Yes, some of them. But that's the thing is you can take those little kind of niche things that happen in a faction or to a character, but you don't necessarily want to expand them out to this is all the faction has a gimmick about. Okay, with the Lannisters, there's a lot of control and subterfuge and things like that happen within that faction and panic effects, but that is kind of ingrained into that faction identity because of the strong lead characters that you have. And even King's Landing as a whole, which the Lannisters, vastly represent, they control everything through fear and tyranny. They're not a monarchy that's leading things. They're not afraid to go and bust heads in the street there if things get dicey. With the Greyjoys, you have your pillage mechanic for them because they are Viking raiders and everything, and that is ingrained into their lore and everything there. With the Martells, poison is something that people just kind of think of and they're okay, yeah, because the main characters that you get the perspectives of, they utilize that and they don't have a problem doing that, versus some of the other kingdoms might view that as a little underhanded, but and shy away from it. The Starks are not going to go and poison people. But the thing is, just because that is a feature does not mean that's something you want to spread across the army. You don't want to have just every single one of their units is just handing out poisons and all their spears are dipped in, laced in toxic venoms and things like that. That's not what the Martells are. That's a facet of them. So you have to take that theme, and that is the first thing that people think about when they think of Martells is certain scenes from the books and shows, unfortunately, and then also poisons.
Yeah.
But it's how you take that aspect of it and incorporate it into a larger faction theme, which is kind of how it came to they're going to debuff the enemy and have a bunch of mobility to represent there's kind of skirmish tactics, their hit and run tactics. And then instead of just being they're just going to throw different poisons and all this stuff there, they're going to play into that idea, but still just use that as more so this is why they do debuffs. This is why they have some control aspects here, is because that kind of fits in with when you think of poisons, people think of roguish figures and kind of these underhanded tactics, but there's more facets to it than that. But all those things kind of play into building a faction.
Makes sense.
And when you say about adding new things and risking with the new, I think that in the case of Song of Ice and Fire, we have a small advantage than other games when you're designing, which is we have great lore to back on. So we kind of know what makes people the same, right? They're all guys with spears. But what makes them new is the flavor, and then you just have to try to adapt that to a mechanic. So I don't really need to justify lore into my mechanic. I need to justify the game mechanics into the lore, right? And then that, to me, for my design process, that is I wouldn't say simpler or easier, but it's just more streamlined in my head, right? I think also because of practice. Yeah, I do believe that we have a big advantage here where we have strong lore to back us up. So like Michael said, we can use the inspiration of them not caring about using underhanded methods or even outright yelling in the court, right, in the king's court and things like that. But at the same time, that is not what just defines the Martells. And then we have to look at each character, right? And in the books, there's a huge story arc that happens with Martells, right? That doesn't really happen in the TV show with a lot of colorful characters.
we don't talk about. Anyhow, yeah.
Right? And then very unique amongst themselves, right? So if we kind of just fell into, let's say, like the Oberyn shtick, it wouldn't fit. Like all his daughters are different, right? And there, once again, there's a whole like political intrigue there, and they work different than the Lannisters type of political intrigue, right? And I'd say even on top of that, that they don't, Lannisters work through panic, right? Their politicians do panic. It really revolves around that. Whereas the Martells, they don't really strike fear into their enemies. They're all about like not striking fear and catching you by surprise.
Yeah, we're just going to do stuff. And by the time, like, we're not even playing the same game as you. And that's, I think, actually a fun little quote there. You know, everyone's playing the Game of Thrones. And yes, the Martells are, but they're not playing the same Game of Thrones as everyone else.
And I think a lot of times we can look to see like the faction identity in a lot of times if you're doing like a quick glance, you can see in two places. First, in the tactics deck, right? That gives a lot of the faction flavor. But the other thing is sometimes you can look at like the core units, and there can be kind of an insight into what the faction is kind of all about, or you can kind of surmise a little bit about that. Do you feel like, oh, that's not a hard rule? Do you feel like that is true here with the Martells as well? If you had to pick like one of the units in the core box, we've got the Spearmen, the Sand Skirmishers, and the Sunspear Dervishes. Do you feel like any one of those in particular like really embodies the core aspects of the Martell force?
Well, so taking it from one single unit, that makes it a little tricky, but that is something that we do when we pick like the units that go into starter boxes. You know, those aren't picked at random. There are ones there because they're supposed to give you a general faction feel about what you have. You know, with like raiders and giants in the free folk, you've got your elite units that come in the Night's Watch starter box. But here with the Martells, we picked 3 units that basically incorporate 3 kind of different aspects you're going to see in the army. And we'll get into the deep dive of these, but just to give the general overview, we have the Spearmen, who are basically going to be the ones that are going to come up and create your kind of front line. And they're not the best at holding defense, but they are going to be able to at least engage the enemy and sustain and basically stay there while the rest of your guys are actually doing their thing, which brings us to like the Sand Skirmishers. You know, these are, as the name suggests, these are your skirmishing unit. They're going to be darting in and around the battlefield. They're very fast. They're going to be scouting openings to actually buff the rest of your troops and getting you that damage in while your front line is tying them up. And then the third unit you have in there is your Sunspire Dervishes, which is your kind of precision melee unit. I guess I shouldn't have said precision because yes, they do actually have precision, but I'm not meaning that in the literal. I guess I am meaning that in the literal sense. But these guys, you know, they've got elusive escape. They've got swift retreat. They're all about just getting in there, hitting them, darting right back out. So already just between, if I just showed you those 3 units working in tandem and nothing else about the faction, that should give you an idea about how they're going to play. Oh, I'm going to take my Spearmen. I'm going to go and lock my opponent up in there. And then I've got my other units here. They're going to be maneuvering around the edges here and basically doing their thing while I'm creating this, this focal point in the front lines here.
You know, one thing I think that stood out to me that I think is going to be really, really fun, but also maybe to me at least marks this faction as a little bit of a finesse faction. Like this is one I can tell that I'm going to need to get some rounds in, but there'll be like a chance to show your skill is on that basic Martell Spearman unit. It's a 5-point unit, and they've got that order tactical reposition at the start of an enemy turn, target one friendly unit in short range, and they can perform a 3-inch shift. That's really cool to have on your kind of like base, more cheaper unit in the box. That really kind of opens up a lot of other possibilities the more and more I thought about it with these other units you've got included. And what a great, like, flavorful way to capture some of the like kind of guerrilla warfare positioning that we kind of associate with this faction.
Yeah, and if you also see that they have, on average, like if you take all these 3 units, pretty good movement speed, right? With only the Spearmen having movement 5, which is already decent, and then the other 2 having movement 6. So when you put these things together, right, you're actually, tactical reposition is increasing a lot of your movement capacity and your threat range, right? And that really, really helps out, especially on infantry units, right?
Oh my gosh, yeah.
Because even here, if you look at their slowest unit they have, which is the Spearmen, which is still average speed of 5, they still have that tactical reposition. So even if it's nothing else, they would be able to start their own turn, shift themselves 3 inches forward, and then make, a 5 plus D6 charge. It's
going to be fantastic. And plus it means that you can open up certain vectors for attack where people are maybe positioning for the flank. And when you start to combine things like the Sand Skirmishers, their quick fire and their scout openings, this looks like you're really going to capture the feel here of the kind of guerrilla warfare getting in and out. And, that being said, the Sand Skirmishers and the Sunspear Dervishes, those are a little bit more expensive units, a 7 and a 6 point unit. Armor 4 plus, decent, but you're certainly not want to be taking like a ton of hits and getting completely like kind of bogged down, because they won't stick around forever.
Yeah, and I guess we'll get into that with the other cards, but Michael already hinted that they really want to debuff the enemy and kind of stop the enemy from being optimal. And you really have to play. It is a finesse faction, like you said, Chase, in that sense that if you just go and charge in and stay there, you will have a pretty bad time, right? You need to do these escapes and these debuffs for them to actually work effectively.
Yeah, this is not going to be a faction where you can just take these guys, ram them toward the enemy, and then just expect to do well. And I see that as, that's something that people are going to need to know coming into the faction, is that until you get your positioning, knowledge down, you're probably going to lose your first few games and everything if your strategy is just, I'm just going to throw my guys right into the meat grind. That's not what this faction is.
You got to be in it for the long haul.
Even in the books, the first Martel to put his face in the meat grinder literally got his head smashed in. Right?
Oh, too soon. So. Well, I think all of these look fantastic, and the sculpts are amazing as well. Do you feel like, maybe switching over to the tactics cards, is there a particular tactics card in the base set that you feel, kind of embodies a lot of this Martel identity, like maybe more so than others? Like, in Free Folk, it might be Endless Horde or Coordination Tactics. In Greyjoy, maybe What is Dead May Never Die. Is there one that you're particularly fond of from a design or thematic perspective for House Martel?
Well, I'd say I like going for the family words card first, and Dent and Broken.
So that's the one when a friendly unit is performing a panic test after rolling dice. They can re-roll any dice for this test, and if you control the attack zone, then they pass this test instead, and they get to target one enemy in long range of this unit and attach this card to them until they are targeted by the attack zone, or until one of your friendly combat units is destroyed. While attached, the enemy suffers -2 to morale tests.
Exactly. And you see, that really fits the faction theme, where it's going to give you a little bit of a benefit, like passing a panic test, right, or re-rolling is already good, but it doesn't make this card great. And what makes the card amazing, right, is attaching it to the enemy and really giving them that debuff and kind of forcing your enemy to play your hand, right, to fall into your hand. So he starts becoming predictable to you.
For me, the card that would actually embodies the kind of Martel things that we've been talking about so far is Rising Temperatures. Whereas, previously you've had cards like Battle Endurance that will grant your own units benefits as the game goes on based on the game round. Here you have the opposite here. Rising Temperatures is you're attaching this card to an enemy unit until they're targeted by the combat zone. That's how the enemy can get rid of it. But while it's attached, they're going to take stacking debuffs based on the game round. So the later in the game that you play this, the worse it's going to be. And so it starts with, still pretty bad effects, like, can't be targeted by tactics cards. But as the games go on, they're -1 to hit. A unit can't restore wounds. And people know that restoring wounds is a very important tactic for a lot of things, and this completely shuts that down unless your opponent plays around it.
In mid game, right?
Especially in the mid game, but especially when it comes to how the some of the Martel strategies can function, because they're not about these big explosive bouts of damage. They're about these kind of small trickling, 1 or 2 wounds is kind of coming in here over so often with some of their effects or some of their poisons. Because yes, there are some poisons, it's not army wide, but you're going to start seeing those little effects, and if, it's going to get annoying. It's basically death by 1,000 cuts. There's not going to be any big explosive play coming from the Martels. It's just a lot of little annoying things that are going to start adding up over time.
And I love the sand diplomacy too, then, where you can have you and your opponent basically have to choose a tactic zone, and the first time it's claimed that round, the NC loses their abilities. So now you can sort of play like other mind games where you maybe know they want to go to this zone to shut something off, and you can start to lay traps. And really some kind of cunning strategies can be employed. Out of these, I think all these tactics cards look amazing. I'm really excited for this faction. Do you think, so in the starter set, typically we'll see kind of like a Victarion Greyjoy, Greatjon Umber, or maybe even like a Tormund. You kind of have your aggressive leader, and that's embodied here by maybe Oberyn. And then you have your more tactical commander, which is in Doran Martell here. And Doran's really interesting in that he's actually an NCU, which is kind of a cool piece here in that in previous editions of the game, we did have NCU commanders. Now, did that update change the way you were designing this character, or were you able to kind of seamlessly transition this to be in that role?
Well, in this case specifically, that didn't really affect too much, because we still basically had this plotted out to how it was going to function even back then, because we had Doran. Now, granted, okay, back then there was a strong chance that he would have just been straight up an NCU commander, and then this other idea that eventually morphed into him being his the way he is now, that would have probably been its own separate thing as well. But because again, we made the decision 3 years ago at this point, time runs together, of removing NCU commanders, then, that original idea had to change. So the way it functions now here is that we have Doran Martell as your army commander, but because you have to have a field presence here and everything, you have Areo-Hotep acting as his basically presence on the battlefield. So you are required to take both of them in your list. And yes, Doran is the one calling the shots, but his whole thing is while he's doing his political machinations, he still has his man on the battlefield here, basically acting as his, his name and everything that's leading the troops.
Yeah, and letting him kind of like dictate and buff Areo-Hotep's unit a little bit there, getting him to be a little bit more maneuverable in a faction where maneuverability is already at a premium here. It's awesome. I think that's a really cool way to take it. Fabio, which do you prefer out of these two commanders? Do you prefer Doran or Oberyn? What's more your style? There's also one really other big element tied to Doran Martell, which is he comes with a little bit of real estate. So we've got him coming with the Water Gardens. Fabio, could you talk us through a little bit like how does this work, and how do you see the Water Gardens maybe switching up or influencing the way the game's being played?
Okay, so when I'll even go back to when we made Piet Pri and the tower, we were already thinking of like who else could have special tactic zones, right? That they bring to the table, which are like really places that do make a difference, right? And we believe that we couldn't put too many of those in. And obviously you could always say like, oh, Winterfell is a place and Casterly Rock is a place, but we tried to keep it at a minimum. And Doran was one that survived the cut, right? Because the Water Gardens are really where he stays the whole time. So they're really tied to him, and the way where he makes people comfortable so he can kind of listen, and all these like Water Garden whispers. So we thought that was really interesting, the way that like he weans his guests in. And how does that change the game? Like I'd say that it really shakes up the way NCUs are played. He can really, because of the Water Garden's effect, right? That after you claim the Water Garden, your opponent must then activate a combat unit if possible.
Yeah.
Right? So that means that you kind of have, you really have a lot more control over the tactics board and over even the battlefield, right? When you do things like that, where your opponent may be forced to activate something that he wanted to hold back for a maneuver, and then you force him to then try to do a longer charge or something of the likes, right? Because of this situation. And we were talking about the Doran commander, but we'll talk more about the Water Gardens when we go to the Doran NCU later, I guess.
My whole thought on that is that basically if it's something iconic enough that South Park has dedicated an almost entire episode to making fun of it, like they did with the Water Gardens.
Oh, now who's walking who through the Betrayal Garden?
Gotcha.
That actually might be one of my favorite like bits there is when Cartman is in his Game of Thrones mode, and literally the entire episode is like 4 times he's leading different people through the walk through the Water Gardens to talk about planning against everyone else. And then finally the old man whose garden they're actually in keeps yelling out the window, don't trust him, he's done this like 3 times today of other people.
And I think that's a good point, Fabio. I need to clarify. So Doran Martell, Prince of Dorne, is the NCU that comes with the Water Gardens zone, and it is Doran Martell, Lord of the Sunspear, which has the on the field commander through Areo-Hotep mechanic. Yeah, and so and then your other NCU is Ellaria Sand, the Viper's paramour. I'm always excited to see like what NCUs you put in the box, and for Martells, there's a lot of like really well-known characters as well as a plethora of many others. But I'm always curious to see like how far are you gonna, how deep are you gonna go on that like initial NCU choice, and what made you think to put Ellaria Sand in the base set here?
Well, she is like, okay, that's the thing with Martells specifically. They have a lot of political figures, which again, we're not going to talk about the show and the dirty deeds that done happen there. We don't talk about the Martell arc of the show. But that's the thing. Sometimes you'll come across a faction that there is just no shortage of interesting characters to use, and this is by far one of them. So this wasn't so much about like, okay, I know, like, let's go back to like the Baratheons, because everyone loves to bring old dear Shira Errol, who even George forgot. Well, okay, I don't, I say that in the nicest way possible, just that she was off script, replaced by a different character later. But Anyway, in that case, that was a unique challenge of the Baratheons about finding some characters that were at least mainly neutral, that didn't, weren't very clearly in one camp. But here with the Martells, man, the short list of characters that could be NCUs was probably greater than almost any other faction. So yeah, this was a list of having to find the ones that fit best as NCUs, because we were releasing a hero box with this with the initial wave as well. So we're not going to really talk about that too much, but even Hero Box 2, spoilers by the way, there's a Hero Box 2 and a Hero Box 3. Spoilers.
What are you doing?
But yeah, so it would have been very easy to fill up every single one of those boxes with nothing but NCUs.
I think that was a quote actually, right? From her, Illyria Sand. I think she was the one that said, "We're everywhere in Dorne. I have 10,000 brothers and sisters." And so Hero Box, only 3 Hero Boxes, huh? Okay.
Yep, hard cap 3 Hero Boxes. That's
another
right.
quote for the ages, folks. We have it. But so it's a pretty solid lineup here, though. These are all recognizable names that, like, even if you're not like, oh, I know the history of the Martells and like the 16 sub houses that might be under their dominion or something, like Illyria Sand, you're going to recognize. And so right in the core box, Oberyn, Doran, Illyria, like that's a really solid lineup. So I think it's going to have a lot of like instant recognizability, which is always great when people are jumping into. Although I did love learning about Shira Errol. That was a fun one to do a little bit of reading on.
A little bit. You need to read a lot to find her there.
She is the Lady of Haystack Hall. How do you not remember that iconic part of the
You made her
books?
famous now. She's famous now.
So fun fact, by the way, to talk about Oberyn specifically, that is another one of our self-references here in the fact that
He's a handsome dude.
Oberyn is glad you say that, Chase, because he is actually Jose Palmera's the head of Big Child Creative, who is the one that sculpts and paints all of the Song of Ice and Fire miniatures. Located in Madrid, Spain.
There we go.
That is him. And there was no small spoilers, by the way, for a 20-year-old book series and 8-season-long TV show. There was no small amount of fun talk back and forth about him getting his head just completely caved in for being, the Red Viper.
Is that going to be somewhere like eventually maybe a lady sculpt and a headless Oberyn or a squished head Oberyn?
I think we would have a better chance of getting a headless Ned Stark before we get a headless Oberyn.
Oh, okay. All right. Actually, switching since we're jumping over to the Oberyn there, Oberyn actually makes use of poison. He's the person in the starter set, if I'm understanding correctly, that is the sole person that's going to be using poison, and he'll have, of course, the infamous Manticore venom. Now, that's tied to vulnerability tokens, and it seems like their generation is a key part of the faction identity. Like there's a lot of things that seem to generate tokens. How do you see poison maybe adding a new layer to gameplay, and what impact do you think it's going to have on the game? And if you can maybe hint or nudge, are we going to see future poisons, you think? And in a similar mechanic style, perhaps?
Oh no, we made just one poison, one game mechanic for just one thing. Where we'll never use those again.
That's it. There's no Basilisk Demon's Dance, Grey Cap, Sweet Sleep.
It's retired to the vault, never to be seen again.
Oh, okay.
Well, that's what I said initially. Is like, this is not going to be like some widespread thing, but you're going to have characters and effects that are going to utilize poison, and they're all going to do different stuff, just like poisons do in real life. I mean, they all do different things.
You seem to know an awful lot about poisons.
Huh?
Did you feel like, I don't know if you can speak to the design process. Was there many iterations of poisons? Was it kind of hard to land on this final piece here?
Well, that's kind of true of everything that we do. The first iteration that we come up with is I'm not going to say it's the worst, but usually it's not the one that, we go with. Sometimes, though, you circle back to the initial iteration after trying a bunch of other stuff and go like, you know what, this one's actually really good. But it tends to just basically morph or evolve over time. But, there were definitely different versions of poisons to how this one came out with. They were originally they were going to be a type of condition token, or, they were going to be its own new thing, kind of like pillage. But the way they shaped up here, at least in the ones that are currently seen, is, they are negative effects that add on to the enemy units. So the Manticore Venom card attaches to an enemy and creates its negative effect there. As not to say that will all function like that, but this is just setting a kind of a pattern or precedent. Basically, expect the unexpected.
Oh,
yeah. Poisons are like a place where we can go pretty wild because we can add a lot of text, like all things considered, because they have a card of their own. So yeah, expect the unexpected.
And that's fun to have like a kind of a space where you can play like that and, you know, test out some new things. And, you know, initially looking at it, I was like, oh my gosh, this seems like so powerful. And yet, you know, when you really start to think about it, like, well, you have to apply it. And then you got to use your resources to generate those tokens. So it builds up like another way you can build for it. And you can, you know, tactically, you know, try to implement, and, you know, your opponent can try to avoid, and it's going to happen, but you got to be mindful of the long game here and expect it. So I don't know. I'm kind of excited to play into this. This is like, you know, I'm certainly someone who needs to like actually push miniatures around a table to really get a good feel of things. But this is something I'm excited to play against and with and get a real sense of. But I'm excited to see like where this is going in a future direction, because poisons like actually are a big part of A Song of Ice and Fire. I know we're talking mostly with the Martells, but things get referenced a lot in the books, whether it's even just like helping people get to sleep. But, you know, something that can show up in all sorts of ways.
Yeah, we get Maester Luwin and get some, you know, milk of the poppy.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And it's like, that's cool to see this entering in. And, you know, I guess it's been fun. We talked about, it's like been years of talking about the game, and like just to see the constant evolution. Like, you know, Pyat Pree was crazy to be like, oh my gosh, we've expanded the tactics board. Now we could potentially have 5 plus Pyat and Doran, you know, 7 zones. We got poison. Like, it's just cool to see how the game's just evolving here. And it, you know, means that the way you play changes too, which is exciting to add those layers. There seems like there's a ton of poisons, right, Fabio?
Yeah, but there's actually only 12 known poisons. And according to the wiki, certain species of mushrooms. If you want that to count, then there's a baker's dozen.
You know, it was actually funny, just a little fun fact out there talking about the initial faction thing. You know, I don't remember how long ago this was, because again, the last, especially 3 years, kind of blurred by a bit. But I remember when we were talking about the poisons here, we were like, yeah, there's enough here where if even if we wanted to take that route, which we knew we didn't want to do, but if we decided to, like, we could make every single tactics card and like commander card in this entire faction a bunch of different poisons. But, you know, so yeah, they're out there.
Somewhere that didn't happen though. You were like, wait a second, we may have gone too far.
Oh, you know, here's your you know, your spearman poison and everything. But it will play a role in the faction, but it's going to be kind of like one of those almost sub-faction themes where you can lean into that as more stuff comes out with it, but it's not going to be a core faction identity. It's just another tool in their arsenal.
Well, I think it's going to be really exciting. And, you know, as also, I'm a big fan of, you know, now you're releasing the factions kind of instead of doing 2 starter sets at the same time with a limited release. We're going to be launching with enough here to, you know, get it in and start playing it in, you know, in a serious manner here. Obviously, you can bring in neutrals and things like that, but being able to have the additional boxes on release and the hero box just opens up so much. So I'm really excited to get this on the table. Now, as we wrap things up here, you know, there might be a chance for people to bump into you in person here, right? Are you guys, a little bird told me that you might be heading over to Gen Con. Is that correct?
Oh, yeah. My first Gen Con. Whoop, whoop.
And how about the grizzled Michael? How about you, the veteran of many long wars?
That honestly felt like a buddy cop moment there, where it's just like the young starry-eyed, like, oh boy, I'm going to Gen Con, and then he made that noise that he just did, which I'm not going to even repeat. But it's like I am just like, yeah, it's Gen Con. God, how many Gen Cons has it been? Anyway, yes, we will both be at Gen Con. So CMON does not have an official booth there, so we are basically splitting our time between the Asmodee area and then the Spin Master area, because we're basically pulling double duty there, where they're promoting like song stuff and everything as well, but also pushing Marvel Zombies with Spin Master, and then whatever else we have time for around. So, you know, you'll definitely see us around there. We will be there somewhere on the premises, somewhere in the city of Indianapolis during those 4 days.
And, you know, Fabio, how many times have you been up to the States?
Well, I've been there once, but like as a child. So like I was like 13 years old or something like that.
And now with what's he +6 because of Song of Ice and Fire.
Yeah, and I'm pretty excited. It's like the USA fascinates me in many different ways, and I'm really curious to go and kind of like see how it is to go like in these big American conventions. It's still pretty glamorized for me. So we need to, as a community, we need to help you out. Yeah, we need to help you out. Okay, we need to. So if you're in the community, maybe think about, you know, what are the things that Fabio needs to experience while he's here? Maybe at Gen Con, but maybe in Indianapolis as a whole. I feel like, you know, one of the cooler fashion things is typically, Fabio, and I don't know if this happens in Brazil too, to when you're visiting a place, to really show your love of it, you get one of these like I heart and then the location name shirts. So make sure you pick up one of those. And then if anyone's got foods, things like that, maybe mentally make a note of that. And if you see Fabio at the convention,
you can suggest some local places to go eat or things like that.
Yeah, for sure. I'm really into like meeting the locals, let's say. Yeah, for sure. And there are some things that make me curious, like that I only see in movies. So like I've never been to a diner. So and things like that, which I really want to go. So yeah.
You will be able to recognize Fabio's. He will be the Brazilian that is there decked out in full American flag regalia on every single article of clothing.
Well, I hope you have a...
Don't expect me to wear like a football t-shirt or soccer for you.
Do you have a
Americans.
baseball cap? Do you have a...
Oh, I need one, right? I guess.
Basically, it's like a passport. Yeah, you have to have it. Well, we'll set you up though, and I hope you have a great time. Yeah, you're lucky. Michael sounds like he'll be looking out for you, making sure you get the full experience.
Oh, geez, Rick.
Oh, we're gonna have fun.
Well, thank you so much for coming on, and I'm looking forward to getting the faction on the table and having fun with it. And I hope you guys have a blast at Gen Con. Unfortunately, I won't be able to be in attendance this year, but everybody be safe. And thanks so much once again for coming on. And in the meantime, I hope you get your miniatures on the table.